All right, so this is kind of a teacher's assistance for teaching Search for Truth. The way I like to teach it, I call it Search for Truth number 3. Now, right here is an overview of the Old Testament and the books involved in the Old Testament. So far, we have been teaching lessons 1 through 6. And what is unique to understand the way Search for Truth is laid out, lessons 1 through 6 all come from these 5 books of the law. One thing that we have to understand is that the Old Testament covers about 3,600 years. One thing we have to understand is the Old Testament covers about 3,600 years. Of those 3,600 years, about 2,000 years of history is covered in just the book of Genesis. So that leaves 1,600 years for all of the remainder of all of these books in the Old Testament. So to start with, we need to understand that lessons 1 through 6 of Search for Truth comes from the law. Once we get those 6 lessons done, what's difficult, and I don't know any better way of doing it right now, but these books, all of these books right here, all come from lesson 7. Lesson 7, one lesson, covers basically from Joshua to the end of the Old Testament. That's one lesson. So from a timeline perspective, in Search for Truth, lessons 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 all come from the 5 books of the law, and then lesson 7 covers everything from Joshua through the end of the Old Testament. Now, the way the Search for Truth approaches this, it doesn't get into too much detail, for instance, with the prophets. So here are the 4 charts that it uses to cover this much material. And it uses 4 charts. It starts with this chart here, I think it's 23, and goes from the death of Moses, Joshua entering into the promised land. It covers the book of Judges also on this chart. So those 2 charts are covered there. The next chart, it goes into the United Kingdom years, 4 kings, Saul, David, and Solomon. This is about 120 years of history. The next chart, it covers the time of the dividing of the kingdom through the captivity when the nation of Israel falls into captivity, Israel and Judah. Then on the 4th chart, it covers the period of restoration to the end of the Old Testament. So these 4 charts basically cover, if we look at it from the outlay of the Old Testament, all of these books here, a great number of books. Now, a lot of this material in these books is very historical, and it can be somewhat dry. So I want to start by looking at more specifically just this period of history right here, these 12 books of history. When we look at just the 12 books of history, they can be broken down like this. The first one is Joshua right here. The next one is Judges right here, 300 years. Next we go into the kingdom years, and the kingdom years basically are from Ruth through the end of 2nd Chronicles. So the kingdom years specifically would be right here from Ruth through 2nd Chronicles. Those would be the kingdom years. Now there's a time of exile where Israel is in captivity for 70 years in Babylon, and they're not in their homeland at all. That period of time is actually recorded in the book of Daniel and in Ezekiel. It's not actually in this portion of books. Then next is the time of restoration, when they are allowed to go back to their homeland and rebuild their temple and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. That is covered in this period of time, known as the Restoration. So in a general sense, I want you to know these three parts: the kingdom years, the exile, and the restoration. Those are the three major portions within this period of time of history that we're going to be talking about on these charts. And we can see that here. Here's your kingdom years, your united kingdom. This is also kingdom years where the kingdom is divided right here on this chart. And then we move into, after the period of time of their captivity, we move into, and the captivity would be covered here with Daniel, we move into the period of time of their restoration. So let's look at the kingdom years more closely. The kingdom years are recorded in 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, and 2 Kings. This same period of time is also recorded in 1 Chronicles and 2 Chronicles. So if we looked at it from a timeline perspective, this would be the timeline, and these books would cover basically the same times, meaning 1 Chronicles covers roughly what 1 and 2 Samuel covers, and 2 Chronicles covers roughly what 1 and 2 Kings covers. The significant difference is that 2 Chronicles and 1 Chronicles covers only the history of the southern kingdom. More specifically, 2 Chronicles covers only this period of time of the southern kingdom, because during 1 Chronicles they were still united during this time. So 1 and 2 Kings would record the history of the north and the south. 2 Chronicles would record only the history of the south. Here's a rough timeline of the things that go on. And you can see there's a bunch of misspellings. I'm sorry about that, but I'm just trying to get a rough cut here real quick. So 1 Samuel, Samuel grows up to become the nation's representative from God. The nation wants a king. Saul is the first king. Saul loses his way. David is anointed the king, second king. David flees from Saul. David becomes king. David's son Solomon reigns after him. Solomon's reign begins. Solomon builds the temple, but Solomon marries many strange wives and falls into paganism. At this time, after Solomon's death, his son Rehoboam reigns next. But he will not lower the taxes, and he refuses to listen to the people, so they rebel, and 10 tribes break away, and they follow Jeroboam. So you got Rehoboam and Jeroboam. I know, it's confusing. Rehoboam and Jeroboam. There's 2 states in the southern kingdom, and there's 10 states in the northern kingdom, or tribes. They're called tribes, but we can think of them as states. The northern kingdom has a total of 20 kings. It lasts about 250 years. All of the northern kings were evil. The northern kingdom falls into gross sin and idolatry. The northern kingdom. So all of the northern kings were evil. They fall into captivity first. In about 700 BC, they fall into captivity to, I believe it's Assyria. It's Assyria. The southern kingdom is not much better, but it does have a few good kings, and they have some short-lived reforms. So the southern kingdom does last longer. It has 20 kings also, and it lasts about 350 years. So the southern kingdom lasts about 100 years longer than the northern kingdom. Solomon's temple, once the southern kingdom falls, the capital of the southern kingdom is Jerusalem. The southern kingdom is called Judah. Once the southern kingdom falls, Solomon's temple is burned to the ground, and there is no temple in Jerusalem. All the people are taken to Babylon in captivity, and there is no nation of Israel at all for 70 years. Now, during this time of the existence of the nations, you have the northern and the southern kingdoms, the split kingdoms, the divided kingdom, that's what they call it. You have prophets to the north, and you have prophets to the south. Prophets to the north are Elijah, Elisha, Amos, Hosea, and then you can see here the prophets to the south: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Joel, Micah, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. So if we look back at our outlay of books, when we look into these books of prophecy right here, some of these prophets are to the north, some of these prophets are to the south, and then furthermore, some of these prophets are to other places. If we look here, we'll see that, let's see, for instance, Daniel is to the exiles in Babylon, but Jonah, he's to Nineveh. He is a prophet to Nineveh. He's not to the north or to the south. He's to a totally different nation. Nahum is concerning Nineveh. But in a general sense, these are the prophets to the south, these are the prophets to the north. But even though God sent them prophets and God warned them, they still did not listen, and they still fell into total captivity. That covers the kingdom years. The kingdom years end. After the kingdom years, as I said, there is the exile in Babylon for 70 years. After the end of that 70 years, there is the restoration period where they are allowed to go back to their homeland and rebuild their home. This is covered in the books of Nehemiah, Ezra, and Zerubbabel. I'm sorry, Nehemiah and Ezra. Zerubbabel's not a book. He's a character in those books. Esther is also a book listed with those three, but it's actually a separate story about a different event in Babylon, about the Jews and how they were spared from destruction. So the period of restoration happens, and this is where the Jews are at the closing of the Old Testament. They have been returned to their homeland. They have rebuilt the temple, but it is now Zerubbabel's temple, which is the second temple, much smaller, much less in its glory than the original temple that Solomon had built. And this is where the Old Testament closes, with them returned to their land, but they're no longer ruling themselves. Someone else is ruling them. Another kingdom comes along, the kingdom of Rome. Rome takes over the world, and Rome is controlling them when Jesus is born and when the New Testament opens. And when Jesus goes into the temple, it is the second temple. Now it's called Herod's temple because Herod took Zerubbabel's temple and expanded it. But that is the second temple that Jesus enters. That temple also would be destroyed in 70 A.D. by the Romans, and there is no temple there now. There will be a third temple built, and that will be a big sign of the coming of the Lord. So we covered the kingdom years, the exile, and the restoration.